The crystal chandelier above the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum of Art dripped light onto the city's elite, a silent witness to 1,000 whispered secrets. But tonight, one secret was about to be screamed. At the center of it all stood Damien Blackwood, a titan of industry whose smile could seal a billion-dollar deal, and his wife Eleonora, the epitome of grace and old-world elegance. To the world, they were a power couple, a dynasty in the making. But as Damien tapped his champagne glass for silence, the beautiful facade of their life was about to be shattered, proving that the most brutal betrayals don't happen in the boardroom. They happen in the heart under the blinding glare of public adoration. The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and blooming peonies. Eleonora Vance Blackwood, known to her friends as Nora, stood beside her husband, a practiced smile gracing her lips. She wore a deep emerald gown that shimmered under the light, a perfect complement to the legendary Vance family emeralds that graced her neck. For 10 years she had played this part, the perfect wife to the self-made billionaire Damien Blackwood. She was the old money Polish to his new money ambition, the quiet grace that tempered his ruthless edge. Their life was a meticulously curated masterpiece. A penthouse on Park Avenue overlooking Central Park, a sprawling estate in the Hamptons, a private jet on permanent standby. But within the gilded cage, the gold had begun to rust. The silence in their vast, sterile apartment was deafening, broken only by the ticking of antique clocks and the unspoken weight of Nora's failure. After a decade of trying of invasive procedures and heartbreaking disappointments, there was still no heir. For a man like Damien, who viewed everything including his marriage as a legacy-building enterprise, this was the ultimate flaw in his otherwise perfect acquisition. "Darling." Damien's voice was a low murmur, his hand a possessive weight on the small of her back. "You look breathtaking tonight." It was the same compliment he gave her at every event, delivered with the same detached sincerity. "Thank you, Damien," she replied, her voice a soft melody that belied the tremor in her heart. He leaned in his breath, smelling of expensive scotch. "Big announcement tonight. The Blackwood Foundation is doubling its endowment for the new pediatric wing. Make sure you look suitably proud." She nodded, the emeralds cool against her skin. It was always about the performance, the public perception. Later, as the applause for his generous donation subsided, Damien raised his glass again. "And on a more personal note," he began, his voice booming with false warmth, his eyes scanning the crowd of New York's most powerful people. He didn't look at Nora. "This has been a year of incredible growth for Blackwood Global. But real growth, true legacy, is about the future. It's about the next generation." A nervous titter went through the crowd. Nora's smile felt frozen on her face. What was he doing? Damien's gaze finally fell upon a young woman standing near the stage. Chloe Sterling, a brilliant raven-haired VP in his acquisitions department, known for her killer instinct and ambition that mirrored Damien's own. She was glowing, her hand resting almost imperceptibly on her stomach. Nora's blood ran cold. "And so," Damien continued, his voice resonating with triumph, "it is with immense joy that I share some personal news. Chloe and I are expecting a child, a son." The silence was absolute, a sonic boom of shock that sucked all the air from the room. 100 pairs of eyes darted from Damien to Chloe, and then with a kind of horrified pity to Nora. The emeralds on her neck suddenly felt like a hangman's noose. Her husband had just publicly executed their marriage. He finally turned to her, his eyes not apologetic, but cold, hard, and final. It was a business decision. She was a failed asset being liquidated. "Eleonora and I have decided to separate," he announced, the lie as audacious as the truth. "We wish each other the best in our future endeavors." The world tilted on its axis. The whispers started a venomous tide rising to drown her. She could feel the stares, the judgment, the morbid curiosity. She stood there, a statue of public humiliation, while her husband, the man she had loved, stood beaming beside his pregnant mistress. She didn't run. She didn't cry. An unnatural calm settled over her. With a grace she didn't know she possessed, she lifted her chin, met the pitying stare of her oldest friend, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. Then she turned and walked, not ran through the parting sea of guests. Each step was deliberate, her back ramrod straight. She walked out of the ballroom, out of the museum, and out of the life that had just been so spectacularly detonated, leaving behind the smoldering ruins of a 10-year lie. The cold night air hit her face, a welcome shock of reality. As a taxi pulled to the curb, a single silent tear finally traced a path down her cheek. The performance was over. The Park Avenue penthouse felt like a mausoleum. The minimalist decor, once chic and sophisticated, now seemed cold and alien. Every object, from the Jeff Koons sculpture in the foyer to the cashmere throws on the sofa, was a testament to a life that was no longer hers. Damien hadn't come home. He had sent a messenger instead, a junior lawyer from his firm, a young man with a nervous tic and a briefcase full of dissolution papers. The terms were as brutal as they were efficient. The prenuptial agreement, which Nora had signed without a second thought a decade ago, was ironclad. She would receive a one-time settlement, generous by any normal standard, but a pittance compared to the Blackwood fortune. She was to vacate the penthouse within 48 hours. A non-disclosure agreement, thick as a novel, accompanied the divorce papers, gagging her for life. She signed everything without reading. What was the point? Damien's message was clear. "You are erased," her maid Maria. A kind woman who had been with her for years helped her pack a single suitcase with tears in her eyes. Nora moved with a numb, robotic efficiency, taking only her personal effects, her books, and a small framed photo of her parents on their wedding day. She left the designer clothes, the jewelry, save for a simple gold locket from her grandmother and the hollow shell of her identity as Mrs. Blackwood. She didn't go to a hotel. She didn't call her society friends who were no doubt feasting on the gossip. Instead, she directed the taxi to a quiet, tree-lined street in the West Village, to a handsome brownstone she hadn't set foot in for nearly 5 years. She paid the driver and walked up the steps, the iron railing cold beneath her hand. She rang the bell, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The door was opened by a man in his late 60s, with a shock of silver hair and eyes the same shade of emerald green as the now abandoned necklace. Arthur Vance looked at his daughter, his face a mask of concern, etched with the deep lines of a forgotten sorrow. "Nora," he said, his voice raspy with disuse. "Hello, Father," she whispered, and then the dam of her composure broke. She collapsed into his arms, the sobs she had suppressed for days racking her body. Arthur held her, patting her back as he had when she was a little girl who'd scraped her knee. He led her inside, away from the prying eyes of the world. The house was filled with books, the scent of old paper and lemon polish, a comforting balm to her frayed nerves. This was the home of her childhood, a world away from Damien's sterile palaces of glass and steel. Arthur Vance was a scholar, a man of intellect and integrity, whose family had been a cornerstone of New York society for generations. He had disapproved of Damien from the start, seeing the rapacious hunger behind the younger man's charm. Damien, in turn, had viewed Arthur as a relic, a dinosaur from a bygone era. The rift between father and daughter had grown when Nora chose Damien's world over her own, culminating in a bitter argument years ago that had resulted in this pained silence. For hours, Nora recounted the entire story, the years of quiet desperation, the emotional neglect, the final public humiliation. Arthur listened without interruption, his expression hardening with a quiet fury. He was my mentee, Arthur said, his voice laced with a bitterness Nora had never heard before. I brought him into the firm. I introduced him to investors. He built his empire on the foundations I helped him lay, and then he pushed me out. I thought he was just ruthless in business. I never imagined his cruelty extended so deeply into his heart. He wanted an heir, Father, Nora said, her voice hollow. It was all he ever talked about. A legacy. A son to carry the Blackwood name. And he discarded you like a barren mare. Arthur spat the venom in his words, startling her. Nora looked down at her hands, twisting the simple gold band on her finger. A ring she would soon no longer have the right to wear. She took a deep, shuddering breath, summoning the courage for her own revelation. The one secret she had been holding close to her chest, a fragile, terrifying hope. That's the thing, Father, she said, looking up, her eyes meeting his. The irony is almost too cruel to bear. She placed a trembling hand on her own stomach, the same spot where she had seen Chloe Sterling rest her hand in triumph. I went to the doctor last week for a routine checkup before starting another round of treatments. The final round, I'd decided. Her voice broke. The tests came back yesterday morning, the day of the gala. Arthur leaned forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. Hope and dread all mingling at once. Father, Nora whispered, a single tear of an entirely different emotion sliding down her cheek. I'm pregnant. 10 weeks. The secret was out, not in a triumphant announcement under the chandeliers of the Met, but in the quiet, dusty study of her estranged father. It wasn't a weapon, not yet. It was a terrifying, precious, and life-altering truth. The heir, Damien Blackwood, had so desperately craved the legacy he had destroyed his marriage for, was the one thing he had just unwittingly thrown away. The following weeks were a blur of quiet consolidation. Nora moved into a guest room in her father's brownstone, a cozy space filled with forgotten childhood books and faded floral wallpaper. The anonymity of the West Village was a sanctuary. Here she wasn't the disgraced wife of a billionaire. She was simply Arthur Vance's daughter. The initial shock gave way to a steely resolve, an emotion she hadn't felt in years. It was fueled by a mother's primal need to protect her unborn child. She knew Damien could not find out about the pregnancy. Not yet. He would use it, twist it, turn it into another battleground. He would claim she was lying, or worse, he would try to take the child. Her child would not be a pawn in the Blackwood legacy game. He won't just let you go, you know, Arthur said one evening as they sat in his study, surrounded by the ghosts of legal scholars and philosophers. Men like Damien don't have ex-wives. They have liabilities. He'll have you followed. He'll monitor your accounts. He's not just closing a chapter. He's sanitizing a narrative. I know, Nora replied, her hand resting on her barely there bump. That's why we can't just hide. We have to fight. Arthur looked at his daughter, truly looked at her, and saw not the fragile society wife, but the sharp, intelligent woman he had raised. The Vance blood, dormant for a decade, was finally stirring. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. "You said he built his empire on foundations you helped him lay." Nora began, her voice low and steady. "And then he pushed you out. Tell me everything. Every deal, every investor, every corner he cut." And so Arthur began to talk. He spoke of the early days when Damien Blackwood was just a hungry, brilliant young man with a chip on his shoulder. He spoke of a crucial seed investment from a Swiss consortium, an investment Arthur had brokered. He spoke of a tech patent Damien acquired under questionable circumstances from a struggling startup. He detailed a pattern of behavior leveraging inside information, aggressively squeezing partners, and burying contractual obligations in labyrinthine legal clauses. "He's a shark who was taught how to swim in my waters," Arthur concluded, his voice heavy with regret. "And I was too proud or too foolish to see the size of his teeth until he'd already taken a bite out of me." Their first call was to Julian Hayes. Julian's father had been the Vance family's lawyer for 40 years. Now the younger Hayes was a rising star in corporate litigation, a razor-sharp lawyer with a reputation for taking on impossible cases. He arrived at the brownstone the next day, his demeanor discreet and his eyes missing nothing. He listened to Nora's story, then to Arthur's. He read the divorce papers and the NDA, his expression grim. "This is a fortress," Julian said, tapping the thick stack of papers. "Damien's lawyers are the best in the business. On the face of it, you have no recourse. The prenup is airtight, and this NDA essentially silences you from ever speaking about him, his business, or your life together." "There's always a crack in the fortress," Nora insisted. "We just need to find it." Julian leaned back, a thoughtful expression on his face. "The NDA has a standard clause. It becomes null and void if Damien is found to have engaged in criminal activity. It's boilerplate, meant to protect the signatory from being an accessory after the fact. His lawyers would have assumed it was an impossibility. A man like Damien doesn't get caught." A slow smile spread across Nora's face. "Then our path is clear. We don't attack the divorce. We attack the man." The war room was Arthur's study. Walls that had once held maps of ancient civilizations were now covered in whiteboards, charting the corporate structure of Blackwood Global. Julian brought in a forensic accountant, a discreet woman named Evelyn Reed, whose mild appearance belied a mind that could untangle the most complex financial knots. While this quiet storm was gathering in the West Village, Damien and Chloe were playing out their perfect love story for the paparazzi. They were photographed buying baby furniture at exclusive boutiques, attending charity functions hand in hand, and giving carefully curated interviews about their whirlwind romance and shared vision for the future. But behind the scenes, the gilded cage was simply being redecorated. Chloe, who had imagined herself a partner, was quickly discovering she was a prized possession. Damien was controlling his obsession with the pregnancy absolute. He dictated her diet, her social schedule, even the color of the nursery. His paranoia, which had always simmered beneath the surface, was growing. He had private investigators put discreet surveillance on Nora, convinced she was plotting something. The PI, a former NYPD detective named Mike Corrigan, was good at his job. He reported back to Damien that Eleanora Blackwood was living a quiet, reclusive life with her father. She visited the library, went for walks in the park, and met with an old family friend, a lawyer named Julian Hayes. There was nothing out of the ordinary. Corrigan didn't report the late-night sessions in Arthur's study. He didn't see Evelyn Reed arriving with encrypted hard drives. He didn't hear the hushed phone calls to retired executives and disgruntled former employees of Blackwood Global. He saw a broken woman licking her wounds. He didn't see a general assembling her army. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Evelyn Reed found the first crack. It was buried in the code of an offshore subsidiary in the Cayman Islands, a company Damien had used to acquire a biotech firm 5 years prior. "It's a ghost code," Evelyn explained, pointing to a string of data on her laptop screen, a set of transactions that appear and then are erased by the system's own logging protocol within microseconds, but they leave a digital echo. She typed furiously. This echo points to a hidden payment schedule, payments made to a shell corporation owned by the lead regulator who approved the acquisition. Julian leaned in closer, his eyes gleaming. "Bribery." "Classic textbook bribery," Evelyn confirmed. "Hidden in plain sight. Arrogant." Nora looked at the screen at the string of numbers that meant nothing to her, but she understood everything. This was the first stone, and she knew exactly where to throw it. Damien Blackwood was a man who thrived on control. He controlled markets, he controlled narratives, and he controlled people. The news of Nora living quietly with her father should have placated him, but it did the opposite. It was too neat, too clean. The Eleonora he knew, the one with a core of Vance steel beneath the silk exterior, would not go down this quietly. His paranoia gnawed at him. He orchestrated a subtle but vicious media campaign. Anonymous sources later traced back to a PR firm on Blackwood Global's payroll began whispering to gossip columnists. They painted a picture of a troubled Eleonora, emotionally fragile and prone to hysterics after years of struggling with infertility. They hinted that the separation was a tragic necessity, a kind of mercy killing for a marriage that had been on life support for years. Damien was framed as the heartbroken husband, forced to move on to find the happiness and family he so deeply desired. Chloe was the innocent, swept up in a love story, not a home wrecker, but a life-saver. The narrative worked. Public sympathy, fickle as ever, began to shift. Nora was no longer the wronged wife, but a pitiable figure, a relic of a failed past that Damien had bravely moved on from. "He's not just divorcing you, he's rewriting history," Arthur said, tossing a copy of the New York Post onto the coffee table. The headline read, "Billionaire's Heartbreak, Blackwood's Ex Unstable After Split." Nora barely glanced at it. Let him. The higher he builds his pedestal, the harder he'll fall. Her focus was singular. With the information from Evelyn, Julian drafted an anonymous encrypted email. It was a masterpiece of implication containing just enough verifiable data about the biotech deal and the offshore subsidiary to be tantalizing, but not enough to reveal their hand. It didn't make a direct accusation. It simply asked the right questions. The email was sent from a secure server to one person, Amelia Vance, a second cousin of Nora's, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal. Amelia, bound by journalistic ethics, could never reveal her source. But the tip was too good to ignore. She began to dig. Meanwhile, life in Damien's penthouse was beginning to lose its luster for Chloe. The thrill of victory was fading, replaced by the reality of her new role. She was the vessel for the Blackwood heir, and her identity was shrinking to fit that single purpose. Her opinions on business, once so valued by Damien, were now dismissed. "You should be resting," he'd say. "Don't stress the baby." She found herself watched constantly, not just by the household staff, but by Damien himself. He questioned her diet, her sleep, her phone calls. One afternoon, he found her on a call with her sister and demanded to know what they were discussing. We were talking about baby names, Damien. She snapped, a flicker of her old fire returning. The name is already decided, he stated coldly. He will be named Damien Blackwood, Jr. What if it's a girl? She challenged. His face tightened. The doctors are certain it's a boy. There will be no mistakes. The implication hung in the air. Mistakes would not be tolerated. Chloe felt a chill that had nothing to do with the penthouse's aggressive air conditioning. She was a placeholder, a means to an end. She had won the Billionaire, but lost herself. The first tremor hit Blackwood Global 2 weeks later. A small article appeared on page A12 of the Wall Street Journal written by Amelia Vance. It was titled Regulatory Questions Surround 5-Year-Old Biotech Merger. It named no names, made no direct accusations, but it detailed irregularities in the approval process of the very deal Evelyn had flagged. It mentioned a key regulator who retired to a lavish lifestyle in the Caribbean shortly after the deal closed. It was a whisper, not a shout, but in the halls of finance, a whisper can be an avalanche. The stock of Blackwood Global dipped by 3%. It wasn't a catastrophe, but it was a warning shot. Damien was incandescent with rage. He stormed into his office, a whirlwind of fury. "Find out who talked to the Journal," he roared at his legal team. "I want a name. I want them ruined." His lawyers, however, came back with nothing. Amelia Vance was a fortress, her sources legendary for their anonymity. The trail was cold. Damien's suspicion immediately fell on Nora. He called Mike Corrigan, the private investigator. "I want more," Damien snarled into the phone. "I don't care what it takes. Bug her house, her phone. I want to know what she orders for dinner and what she dreams about at night. She's behind this. I know it." "Mr. Blackwood." "That's highly illegal," Corrigan replied, a seasoned professional who knew where the lines were. "I can maintain surveillance, but I can't break the law." "Then find someone who can," Damien retorted, and slammed down the phone. But Julian Hayes had anticipated this. From the beginning, he had operated on the assumption that they were being watched. He had a cybersecurity expert sweep the brownstone weekly for bugs. All their sensitive conversations happened in a specially secured room in Julian's office. They used burner phones and encrypted messaging apps. Damien's brute force was being met with surgical precision. The small stock dip, however, had an unintended consequence. It spooked investors. To calm the markets, Blackwood Global had to open some of its books for an internal audit to prove the company's stability. It was a standard procedure, but Julian and Evelyn had been waiting for it. They had a contact on the inside, a junior accountant, who had been passed over for a promotion in favor of one of Damien's cronies. The man was bitter and looking for payback. Late one night, Julian received another encrypted file. It was a treasure trove. Internal memos, hidden expense reports, and most damningly a preliminary geological survey for a mining operation in South America. The survey, which Damien had buried, showed a catastrophic risk of water table contamination for the local indigenous communities. The official report submitted to the environmental regulators had been a complete fabrication. This wasn't just bribery anymore. This was a potential humanitarian and ecological disaster. It was fraud on a massive scale with devastating human consequences. Nora looked at the report, her stomach churning with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. "He didn't just push my father out," she said softly. "He didn't just humiliate me. This is who he is. He poisons everything he touches." The storm was no longer gathering. It was about to break. The leak of the fraudulent environmental report needed to be handled with extreme care. A direct release would be too obvious, tracing a clear line back to a disgruntled party. Nora, guided by Julian's strategic mind, opted for a more insidious route. They wouldn't give the story to the financial press. They would give it to the people Damien had wronged. Julian used an anonymous intermediary to deliver the buried geological survey to a small, fiercely independent environmental advocacy group that had been protesting Blackwood Global's mining operations for months. He also sent it to a respected international human rights lawyer based in Geneva. The effect wasn't immediate, but it was potent. The advocacy group, now armed with irrefutable proof, organized larger, more vocal protests. The story was picked up by international news outlets not as a business story, but as a human rights issue. The name Blackwood Global was suddenly associated with images of endangered communities and poisoned water. The brand Damien had spent decades building, the brand of a visionary and a philanthropist, was being tarnished with a stain that money couldn't easily wash away. Damien was besieged. The board of directors, once pliant and deferential, was demanding answers. Government regulators in 2 countries opened official inquiries. The stock, which had recovered from the first dip, now began a slow, steady bleed. The crisis consumed all his time and energy, pushing his carefully constructed personal life to the periphery. His paranoia, once a simmering ember, now blazed. He saw conspiracies everywhere. He became more controlling, more volatile. His relationship with Chloe, already strained, began to crack under the pressure. One evening, Chloe tried to broach the subject. "Damien, the news. Is any of it true?" she asked tentatively, gesturing to the television, where protesters were chanting outside a Blackwood Global office. "It's a smear campaign," he snapped, not taking his eyes off the screen. "Orchestrated by my ex-wife. She's trying to ruin me because she couldn't give me a son." The casual cruelty of his words struck Chloe. She had been his partner in ambition, yet he spoke of this monumental crisis as if it were a simple domestic squabble. She saw then that in his world, everything and everyone was transactional. Love, loyalty, even their unborn child, they were all assets or liabilities in the grand ledger of his ego. Her own secret began to feel heavier. The lie she was carrying was a ticking bomb, and she was standing right next to it. Nora watched the fallout from the quiet sanctuary of her father's home. There was no joy in it, only a grim sense of necessity. Every headline that condemned Damien was a shield for her and her child. Her pregnancy was progressing smoothly, and she was now beginning to show. The secret was becoming harder to keep, but for now her reclusive lifestyle kept it safe. Julian believed it was time for the next step. "His attention is divided," he argued during one of their strategy sessions. "He's fighting a war on 2 fronts and bleeding capital. Now is the time to hit him at home." The hit was a legal filing. It wasn't a lawsuit for more money. It was a petition to invalidate the NDA. The grounds were specific and explosive. Nora alleged that she had been coerced into signing the agreement while under extreme emotional distress, and more importantly, that she had reason to believe Damien Blackwood had engaged in fraudulent activities. During their marriage activities, she could no longer be legally bound to stay silent about. The petition was filed in a state court, known for being tough on corporate malfeasance. It was a declaration of war. The filing was a matter of public record, and the media pounced on it. The vague whispers of Nora's instability were now countered by a formal legal allegation of corporate crime. The narrative Damien had worked so hard to control was shattered. When Damien was served the papers, his rage was volcanic. This was a direct assault. Nora wasn't just leaking information. She was putting her name on an accusation. He saw it as the ultimate betrayal. He immediately called his lead attorney a ruthless legal shark named Marcus Thorne. "I want her destroyed," Damien seethed. "Countersue, defamation, slander. I want her left with nothing. Not even her father's dusty old books. A countersuit is risky," Marcus advised, his voice calm and steady. "It opens you up to discovery. They'll be able to subpoena documents, communications. I don't care. She is lying. Is she?" Marcus asked the question hanging in the air. "Damien, before we go nuclear, you need to tell me. Is there any fire underneath all this smoke? Any of it?" Damien was silent for a long moment. "My business is my business," he said finally. "Just crush her." But Marcus Thorne was a lawyer, not a magician. He knew that a legal battle once started was an uncontrollable beast. And he suspected that Eleanora Vance Blackwood, represented by the clever Julian Hayes, was not coming to this fight with an empty gun. The first strike had landed, and the damage was far more than financial. It had pierced Damien's armor of invincibility. It had sown doubt among his allies and emboldened his enemies. And for Nora, it was a profound moment of reclamation. She had taken back her voice. The quiet, graceful wife was gone. In her place was a woman who had found her strength ready to face the man who had tried to erase her and protect the future growing inside her. The legal battle became a grinding war of attrition. Damien's lawyers filed motion after motion to have Nora's petition dismissed, but Julian Hayes countered each one with meticulous legal arguments. The discovery process began a slow, agonizing exchange of documents. Julian's team sent out a blizzard of subpoenas, requesting everything from Damien's personal emails to the minutes of board meetings going back a decade. Marcus Thorne's team did the same, demanding Nora's medical records, diaries, and correspondence, hoping to build a case that she was an unstable, vindictive source lashing out. But Nora had lived a transparent life. There were no hidden skeletons. The only secret she kept was the one nestled safely in her womb, a secret her doctors, bound by confidentiality, would not reveal. The pressure on Damien was immense. His company was now facing multiple government investigations. His stock price was in a tailspin, and his personal life was the subject of a very public and very messy court case. His legendary focus was fractured. He grew short-tempered and paranoid, trusting no one. It was during this period of intense scrutiny that Evelyn Reed, the forensic accountant, made her most devastating discovery. It wasn't in a corporate ledger or an offshore account. It was in the payment records for a high-end, extremely discreet fertility clinic in Switzerland. Damien Blackwood has been a patient there for 15 years. Evelyn reported to Nora and Julian, her voice flat with professional calm. "He started treatments long before he even met you, Nora. The diagnosis is consistent across every test: azoospermia, 0 sperm count. It's congenital and irreversible." The room went silent. Nora stared at Evelyn, her mind struggling to process the information. All those years, all the invasive treatments she had undergone, the hormones that had ravaged her body, the crushing sense of failure and inadequacy she had carried. All of it had been a lie. "He knew," Nora whispered the words, catching in her throat. "The whole time, he knew he was the one who was infertile." "He let you take the blame," Arthur said, his face pale with fury. "That monster let you believe you were the failure." The cruelty was breathtaking. He hadn't just discarded her for failing to produce an heir. He had discarded her for his own failing, making her the scapegoat for his own biological inadequacy. His obsession with a son, A legacy was the desperate cry of a man who knew he could never naturally create one. And then the final horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "Chloe!" Nora said, her eyes wide with a dawning, sickening realization. "Her pregnancy!" Julian nodded grimly. "If Damien can't have a child, then the baby she's carrying. It isn't his." The implications were staggering. Was Chloe lying to him? Or was this something even more twisted, a scheme they had concocted together? The answer came from an unexpected source. Mike Corrigan, the private investigator Damien had first hired, had been quietly let go after refusing to engage in illegal surveillance. He was a man with a moral code, and he'd been disgusted by Damien's obsessive rage. He reached out to Julian Hayes. "I don't like what Blackwood was asking me to do," Corrigan explained, meeting Julian in a quiet coffee shop. "But I did my job before he fired me. I ran a background check on the girlfriend Chloe Sterling. There's something you should see." He slid a file across the table. It contained travel itineraries. 6 months before the gala, Chloe Sterling had taken a vacation to a renowned fertility clinic in California, a clinic that specialized in IVF and anonymous sperm donors. The dates lined up perfectly with the timeline of her pregnancy. "She wanted the billionaire's life," Corrigan said, "and she knew what he wanted above all else, so she went and got it for him, or at least made him think she did." Chloe had played Damien just as ruthlessly as he had played everyone else. She had secured her position with a child that looked like a Blackwood heir, but shared none of his DNA. She had given the Baron King his legacy, a legacy built on a complete and total fraud. This was the secret that could destroy him. Not the corporate crimes which he could fight with lawyers and money, but the personal humiliation. The revelation that his entire narrative, the potent billionaire securing his dynasty, was a pathetic lie. His son was not his son. His virility was a sham. His legacy was a stranger's bloodline. Nora now held the ultimate weapon. It was a weapon of such devastating power that it could not just ruin Damien Blackwood's company, but annihilate the very core of his being. The question was no longer how to fight him, but how to deliver the final fatal blow. The final confrontation did not happen in a courtroom or a boardroom. It happened where it all began, the Park Avenue penthouse. Nora, through Julian, requested a face-to-face meeting with Damien to discuss a final settlement. She insisted on 2 conditions: that they meet alone, and that they meet in their former home. Fueled by arrogance and a belief that she was finally ready to capitulate, Damien agreed. He dismissed Chloe to an afternoon at the spa, wanting to savor this final victory by himself. When Nora stepped out of the private elevator and into the penthouse foyer, she felt a strange sense of detachment. The space that had once been her prison now felt small and insignificant. She was no longer the woman who had tiptoed through these marble halls, desperate for a scrap of affection. Damien was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glass of scotch in his hand, the Manhattan skyline his backdrop. He looked haggard, the stress of the past few months having etched new lines around his eyes, but he wore his expensive suit like armor. "Eleonora," he said, his voice smooth and condescending. "I'm glad you've finally come to your senses. This whole affair has been unseemly." "Has it, Damien?" Nora replied, her voice calm and clear. She walked further into the room, her presence filling the space in a way it never had before. She was 5 months pregnant now, her condition tastefully concealed by a flowing silk blouse, but she carried herself with a newfound strength. "End this nonsense," he said, taking a sip of his drink. "Withdraw the petition. Sign a revised NDA. I'll even increase the settlement as a gesture of goodwill. Consider it a severance package for your years of service." Nora almost laughed. The audacity, the sheer unadulterated ego of the man. "I'm not here for your money, Damien. I never was." "Then what is this all about?" he demanded, his patience thinning. "Revenge. A pathetic attempt to hurt me because I moved on." "No," she said, stopping a few feet from him. "This is about the truth." She began to lay it all out, not with anger, but with the cold, precise finality of a judge delivering a verdict. She started with her father, Arthur Vance, detailing how Damien had used his mentorship and connections only to cast him aside once he was no longer useful. "A necessary business decision," Damien scoffed. He was sentimental. He lacked the killer instinct. "Then we can talk about the South American mine," she continued, her voice unwavering. "The real geological survey. The one that shows you are knowingly poisoning thousands of people to protect your profit margin." His face darkened. "Allegations. Lies fed to you by my enemies. And the biotech acquisition," she pressed on. "The payments to the regulator's shell company, Evelyn Reed, is quite the artist when it comes to uncovering digital ghosts." Damien's composure finally cracked. He slammed his glass down on the table. "What do you want, Nora?" "Just name your price. I told you," she said softly. "This isn't about money." She took a deep breath, preparing for the final devastating revelation. "This is about legacy. Your precious legacy, the son you announced so proudly at the Met Gala." A flicker of confusion, then suspicion, crossed his face. "For 10 years, Damien, I subjected my body to grueling treatments. I injected myself with hormones. I endured countless humiliating procedures. I carried the weight and the shame of our childlessness, and you let me. You watched me cry myself to sleep month after month, and you let me believe I was broken. It was a tragedy. But stop lying," she interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like glass. "I know about the clinic in Switzerland. I know about your diagnosis, azoospermia. A congenital condition you've known about since you were a young man. The problem was never me, Damien. It was always you." The color drained from his face. The armor was gone. He looked at her, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated horror. He was stripped bare, his deepest, most shameful secret exposed. "That's impossible," he whispered, the words hollow. "Is it?" Nora continued, relentless. "Which means that Chloe, well, she is as ambitious as you are, I'll give her that. She knew what you wanted, what you needed to feel like a man. So she went to a clinic in California and bought it for you. An anonymous donor, Damien. That's your legacy. The son who will carry the Blackwood name shares none of your blood. Your entire dynasty is a lie." He stared at her, speechless. The entire edifice of his life, his ambition, his very identity had crumbled to dust in the space of 30 seconds. He had destroyed his marriage, tarnished his company, and humiliated his wife, whole for a future that was a complete fabrication. Nora placed her hands on her own stomach, a gentle, protective gesture. "You see, the ultimate irony, Damien, is that you threw away the one thing that was real." She turned and began to walk away. He found his voice a ragged, desperate sound. "Nora, wait. Is that—" She paused at the door of the elevator, turning back to face the broken man standing amidst the ruins of his life. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong, without a trace of malice or triumph, only a profound, quiet finality. "He is your son, your only son, and you will never be a part of his life." The elevator doors slid shut. leaving Damien Blackwood utterly and completely alone with the wreckage of his truth. He had lost everything, not because of a corporate takeover or a market crash, but because he had fundamentally misunderstood the meaning of value. He had traded gold for dust. The silence that descended upon the penthouse after the elevator doors closed was a physical entity. It pressed in on Damien heavier than any market pressure he had ever faced. For a long time, he didn't move from the spot where Nora had left him, the city lights below, blurring into meaningless streaks of color. The architect of a vast empire, the master of a universe of his own making, had just learned his entire cosmos was a lie. The foundation wasn't cracked. It had never existed. When Chloe returned from the spa radiant and relaxed, she found him standing in the near darkness, the fallen Scotch glass still shattered on the floor. "Damien, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her smile faltering as she sensed the frigid atmosphere. He turned to face her, his expression devoid of the fury she might have expected. It was something far worse, a hollow, dead emptiness. "The performance is over, Chloe," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "She knows." Chloe's blood ran cold. "She knows what the business deals, the petition. Everything." He cut her off, the single word carrying the weight of total annihilation. "She knows about Switzerland. She knows about California. She knows that the child you are carrying is not mine." There was no accusation, no rage. It was a statement of fact, a final grim tallying of the accounts. Chloe, ever the survivor, didn't crumble. Her own mask of the doting mother-to-be fell away, revealing the hardened ambition beneath. "So what now?" she asked, her voice steady. "Now you leave," Damien said. "A wire transfer will be made to an account of your choosing. It will be substantial. In return, you will sign a document, an NDA of your own, and you will disappear. You and the donor's child will cease to exist in my world." He didn't care about her betrayal. In his mind, she had simply been a contractor who had failed to deliver the correct product. The transaction was terminated. There was no emotion, no heartbreak. There was only the cold, brutal calculus of damage control. She had been a means to a fraudulent end, and the fraud had been exposed. The next 72 hours saw the complete and systematic dismantling of Damien Blackwood. News of the Swiss clinic and Chloe's deception strategically leaked by Julian's team to a single trusted source detonated in the press. The story was a media supernova, a perfect storm of corporate malfeasance, personal hubris, and shocking betrayal. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a fool. His carefully cultivated image of potent masculine power was replaced with that of a deluded, sterile tyrant. The public mockery was perhaps more damaging than the SEC investigation. The emergency board meeting was a formality. The men and women who had once deferred to his every command now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He was no longer a titan. He was a liability of catastrophic proportions. He signed his resignation without a word, his signature once a symbol of immense power, now just ink on a page, admitting defeat. As he left the Blackwood Tower for the last time, a work crew was already preparing to remove the towering silver letters of his name from the facade. While Damien's world was imploding, Nora's was acanding in quiet, concentric circles of joy. 4 months later, in a private room in a quiet hospital, she gave birth to Arthur Vance Jr. The birth was peaceful, attended only by her father and a trusted doctor. Holding her son, for the first time, Nora felt a love so profound and absolute it eclipsed all the pain that had come before. He had her emerald green eyes and a stubborn tuft of dark hair. He was perfect. He was real. Her father, Arthur Sr., held his grandson, tears streaming down his face. "This Nora," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "This is legacy." Nora's first official act as the head of the newly chartered Vance Foundation was to fully fund the legal and environmental restoration efforts for the South American communities whose lives Damien's mine had threatened. She flew down to meet with the community leaders herself, with baby Arthur safely in the care of his grandfather. She didn't send a check. She went in person, listening to their stories, her presence a quiet promise that integrity could triumph over greed. The press called it poetic justice. For Nora, it was simply the right thing to do. It was the first brick in a new foundation, one built not on power, but on principle. A year passed. The name Damien Blackwood faded from the headlines, becoming a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. He lived in self-imposed exile in a stark modern villa in an undisclosed European location. He had his fortune, but he had lost his name, his purpose, and the one thing he now craved above all else, a connection to the son he had thrown away. Sometimes he would see a picture of Nora and her child in a magazine leaving a park, entering a museum, and he would be consumed by a sterile, powerless rage that eventually faded into a familiar, gnawing emptiness. One crisp autumn afternoon, Nora was in the garden behind the West Village brownstone. The house, once a symbol of her estrangement, was now a vibrant home, filled with the sounds of a happy baby. She pushed Arthur on a small wooden swing her father had hung from the old oak tree. The late afternoon sun filtered through the golden leaves, dappling the ground in light. Her son laughed, a pure, uncomplicated sound that was the anthem of her new life. She had done more than survive. She had healed, she had built, and she had reclaimed not only her family's name, but her own soul. The ghost of Damien Blackwood no longer haunted her. He was a chapter in a book she had long since finished reading. Her story was no longer about betrayal. It was about the beautiful, unfolding future embodied in the joyful laugh of her son as he swung higher and higher into the light. In the end, Damien Blackwood's empire didn't fall with a crash. It dissolved in the acid of its own lies. Faced with irrefutable proof of fraud and the soul-crushing humiliation of his personal life, he was forced out by his own board. He lost the company, the penthouse, and the fake legacy he had sacrificed everything for. Chloe vanished, taking her own secrets with her. But this story isn't truly about the fall of a titan. It's about the rise of a queen. Eleanora Vance Blackwood, now simply Nora Vance, gave birth to a healthy baby boy she named Arthur. She didn't seek revenge. She sought restoration. Using her inheritance and her father's guidance, she established a foundation dedicated to ethical business practices and environmental justice, turning the poisoned legacy of the Blackwood name into a force for good. She proved that true strength isn't about how much you can control, but about what you choose to build. Her story is a powerful reminder that the most perfect-looking lives can hide the most painful secrets, but also that our deepest betrayals can sometimes lead to our greatest liberation. What did you think of Nora's ultimate decision? Was her revenge justified? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by this story of resilience and justice, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will stay with you long after you've finished listening. Thank you for joining us.